If you're listening to this episode, it's very likely that you are knee deep in interview strategies, interview mode, trying to find a new role. It's the world that we're living in, and it can be incredibly stressful and frustrating, especially if you are unemployed. I mean, one of the best things I always tell my clients is the best time to interview is when you don't actually need a job. But if you don't have that luxury, what can you do to set yourself apart from the rest? We know that the job market is crazy. We know that it's difficult being able to just apply for a job online and actually get called in to an interview. Their fallback plan is no longer working, right? I have women all the time that talk about I would settle for a director level role, or I would settle for a senior manager role, even though they've already operated at the vice president level in the past. But they can't even find those job opportunities. The very first way that you might be sabotaging your interviews is not knowing your audience. Who are you talking to in the interview process? There is something very different that a recruiter needs to hear from you versus a hiring manager versus the CEO of an organization. So you must know how to speak to each of your different audiences and exactly what they need to hear from you in order to push you on to the next level. I have an entire video about this inside of my Women's Leadership Accelerator program where we go into all the details of each one of these positions and exactly what they need to hear from you. But I want you listening to this episode to first ask yourself, what does a recruiter need to hear from you? What does a hiring manager need to hear from you? What does the CEO need to hear from you in order to push you through to the next round? I guarantee you might have some answers and begin to tailor your interview answers in that way. Or if you're direct messaging a hiring manager versus a recruiter versus the CEO of an organization versus just an employee, an acquaintance, another ally that you might have that works inside of that interview or works inside of that organization, what does that person need to hear from you in order to push you through to the next round? So when you know your audience, you're going to stand out above the rest. The second thing that a lot of women are doing to sabotage their interview chances of making it to that next round is that they're starting at the beginning. You need to know that your resume has already been looked at. Your LinkedIn profile has already been reviewed. They have combed through it. The algorithm has combed through it. You've made it into the room. So don't go back in time and recite your resume, especially when they ask you that question of like, tell me about yourself. And you go through all of your job qualifications, something that they could have just read on the paper. So I always tell all of the women that I work with that you need to make your resume three-dimensional. In the interview process, you're bringing that resume to life. You're telling a bigger story, the bigger picture about you and about what you bring to the table as an executive leader. And it's really important to paint that picture for them because they have already read your resume, right? Assume that you belong in the room. And then when you can show up from that place, then you are actually showing them what you're going to be like to work with. You're going to show them what you actually stand for, what matters, why they need to bring you into their organizations. This is going to help you stand out above the rest and not just reciting your resume. And I talked about this episode is about ways that you're sabotaging your interviews. And you're actually hurting yourself when you go back in time, right? Like you don't want to start off the interview in this like boring way, right? You don't want them to think, oh my gosh, they aren't very discerning in their executive communication skills, which, by the way, is a requirement of executive leadership. So I want you to stand out among the noise, right? I want you to go above and beyond your resume. Another thing that women, number 3, that they're doing to sabotage their interviews is they're sticking to the STAR method. Now, I don't have a problem with the STAR method specifically. I think it's really helpful, specific, tangible, actionable results that you've gotten for your organization. This method has helped a lot of women, really speak to those results, those things that we're shying behind, like actual ROI that we've brought our organizations and our storytelling. But the problem is that we're leaving it at that. So in order to not just rely on the STAR method, you need to think of your STAR method as homework, right? Like it gets you to the specifics of your storytelling. But now I want you to bookend it with a beginning and an end, right? So the star method is the middle, is the story itself. But what's the point? Why am I telling you the story? What do I want you to take away from the story? And an ending, which is like basically recapping the beginning so that they listen to you and they have a reason to believe your story, a reason to want to continue working with you. The fourth way that women are sabotaging their interviews is they're creating new stories for every single answer. You know, answering the question, tell me about your strengths, is very similar to tell me about yourself, right? Answering the question, what's your leadership style, can be very similar to how you would solve this problem. And so you only need to come up with a handful of stories, really good stories, and then memorize those and then you can plug and play. You can apply those to so many different situations. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you get asked an interview question. I want you to show up confidently and have a very powerful executive presence, right? And the way that you do that is you practice. You practice what you're going to say, but you can't practice 40 different interview answers. Instead, you can practice 5 really good and solid ways to answer interview questions and then plug and play, repeat them in various different ways so that you can get through this interview and then they see you as like this, oh my God, she's amazing, right? We need her on our team. And the fifth and final way that you are sabotaging your interviews is that you're trying to be good at interviewing. You're answering your interview questions in a pretty perfect way. If you walk away from your interview and you say, I did a pretty good job at that interview, then chances are you actually didn't do a good job at that interview. I want your interviews to sound like conversations. I want you to be slightly confused. Like I lost myself at one point. At one point, I answered an interview question out of sequence. Like I don't even know if I answered it the right way. I was just talking to them. Another way that you can know you did a good job on your interview is if the person interviewing you talks more than you do, right? That's an amazing way to go through an interview process because they are actually saying, hey, I'm engaged with you. I am treating you like a peer instead of being perfectly polished in all of your answers. It also gives you so much freedom to be able to go back and try again. Like using the do over method, you can go back and you can say, hey, let me go back in time and try that again. Like I didn't get off on the right. I wasn't actually telling you what I meant to say. We want to know who we're hiring, who's actually going to start the job the next day, not this perfectly polished person who we know is not going to show up like that every day. Or if they do, then we're just bringing another yes person into our organization. And we need someone who can do difficult things, who can have hard conversations, who can push the envelope, who sounds like a real, confident executive leader. I guarantee that's the type of job that you want, right? You want to work at an organization where your voice is actually heard, where your voice matters at the company. And when you show up in this real, transparent, authentic way, which, by the way, is very powerful, right? Not authentically sloppy, right? You show in this powerful, authentic way, then they're going to see you as the person that they need to bring into their organizations, right? So these are 5 ways that you might be sabotaging your interviews, but you don't have to continue sabotaging your interviews. Bye.